A state trooper's flashlight sweeps across the inside of a parked sedan on a dark Montana highway in October of 2022. It is nothing unusual, a broken taillight, a routine stop, the kind of interaction that happens 1,000 times a night across the country and is forgotten within the hour. The trooper asks the passenger, a young man in his early 20s, for identification. The young man hands it over without hesitation. The name on the license matches the name in the system. Everything checks out. And yet 18 years earlier, in a different state, under a different sky, a 4-year-old boy walked toward a parking lot full of pickup trucks and dust and never came back. We will return to that traffic stop. We will return to it more than once because in the end it becomes the thread that pulls an entire 18-year absence back into the light. But to understand why a broken taillight in Montana would eventually matter to a family that had been waiting since 2004, we have to go back to where the story actually begins, at a harvest festival in the northern reaches of Idaho on a Saturday afternoon that started out like any other. The festival had been a tradition in that part of the state for over 2 decades, held each September on the open fields, bordering a state park known for its pine ridges and a slow, cold river that cut through the valley below. Families came from 3 counties to attend. There were pie contests, hay bale mazes, a small stage for local bands, and rows of vendor stalls selling apple cider and knitted scarves against the first chill of autumn. It was the kind of event where children ran freely between booths while their parents kept half an eye on them and half an eye on conversations with neighbors they only saw once a year. If you've ever spent an afternoon at an event like this, the kind with hundreds of people, dozens of tents and children weaving between legs and lawn chairs, you know how easy it is to lose sight of someone for 30 seconds without a single thought of worry. That ordinary, forgivable inattention is where this story begins, and it's worth sitting with that for a moment before we go further. If you're new to Archive 26, welcome. And if you've been with us for a while, thank you for coming back to sit with another one of these cases. We reconstruct stories like this one from records, interviews, and reporting because we believe these families deserve to be remembered carefully. If that matters to you too, consider subscribing before we continue. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, a young couple, parents of a 4-year-old boy, were helping volunteers restock a community stand near the center of the fairgrounds. Their son had been playing in a small fenced area designated for young children, no more than 30 feet from where they stood. It was watched loosely by a rotation of parents, as such areas often are, with no single person formally responsible for keeping count of who came and went. According to statements later gathered by investigators, several festival goers recalled seeing a small boy in a red jacket walking, unhurried and apparently unbothered, toward the temporary parking area set up in the field beyond the vendor tents. No one thought much of it. Children wandered toward parents and back again all afternoon. It was only when the mother turned to check on her son and did not see him where he had been moments before that anything felt different. She called his name. She walked to the play area. She asked the nearest parents if they had seen him. The answers were vague, a nod here, a shrug there, a general sense that he'd been seen a few minutes ago. Minutes stretched. The father joined the search. Volunteers who had been stacking crates began scanning the crowd. By the time festival organizers were alerted and a public announcement was made over the loudspeaker system, nearly 20 minutes had passed since anyone could say with certainty that they had seen the boy. 20 minutes does not sound like much, but at a fairground with thousands of people, dozens of exits, and a parking lot large enough to hold hundreds of vehicles, 20 minutes is an eternity. It is enough time for a small child to cross an open field. It is also enough time for someone else to have made a decision that would not be undone for 18 years. By 5 o'clock, the local sheriff's department had been notified. By 5:30, the first patrol units were on scene, walking the grounds with festival staff, checking bathrooms, tents, and the tree line at the edge of the property. The mother would later describe those first minutes as a kind of suspended disbelief, the sense that surely he was simply hiding somewhere nearby, that surely this was the kind of thing that resolved itself within the hour, the way lost children usually do. But this one didn't. As the sun began to lower over the ridge and the temperature started its familiar autumn drop, a search dog handler arrived with 2 trained dogs and asked for an article of the boy's clothing. The dogs picked up a scent near the play area almost immediately, moved with purpose across the open field, past the vendor stalls, past the hay bale maze, and stopped abruptly at the edge of the temporary parking lot. There the trail ended. Not faded, not lost in confusion, ended cleanly, as though the scent itself had simply stepped off the earth. It was the kind of detail that experienced searchers understand immediately and dread just as immediately, because a scent trail that ends at a parking lot rather than continuing through it usually means one specific thing. The person being tracked did not walk any further. They got into a vehicle. By nightfall, that single detail had reshaped the entire response. What had begun as a routine search for a wandering toddler was now being treated as something far more serious. Radios crackled with new instructions. Additional units were requested from neighboring counties. And somewhere in that darkening field, a mother stood clutching her son's small red jacket, refusing to believe that the last place his scent had ever been detected was the trunk-lined edge of a gravel parking lot she had walked past 100 times that day without a second thought. Within 12 hours of the boy's disappearance, the case had escalated to a scale rarely seen in that part of Idaho. The county sheriff's office, understanding the limits of its own resources, requested assistance from state police, and by the following morning, agents from the regional FBI field office had joined the investigation as well. A standard step in cases involving young children when foul play cannot be ruled out. More than 300 volunteers arrived at the fairgrounds over the next 2 days, some organized through official search and rescue channels, others simply local residents who had heard the news and felt they could not sit at home while a child was missing. Search grids were mapped across the surrounding forest, along the riverbank, and through the drainage culverts that ran beneath the county road. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging passed over the tree line at dawn and dusk. Divers were brought in to check the slower bends of the river, a grim but necessary precaution given the property's proximity to water. Investigators returned again and again to the detail that troubled them most, the abrupt end of the scent trail at the parking lot. If the boy had wandered off on his own, into the woods or toward the water, the dogs should have been able to continue tracking him. Children who wander do not simply vanish from a trail, they leave scent through brush, through mud, through hours of movement. The clean break at the parking lot suggested something else entirely, and investigators began building their working theory around the possibility that someone had placed the boy into a vehicle, whether by force or, more troublingly, without resistance from the child himself. That distinction mattered enormously. A 4-year-old who is frightened tends to fight or cry or resist in ways that draw attention. Investigators interviewing vendors near the parking lot that afternoon found no one who recalled hearing a child in distress. One vendor, a woman selling handmade quilts from a folding table near the lot's entrance, told deputies she remembered seeing a man and a little boy walking together sometime in the mid-afternoon, though she could not recall the man's face with any clarity and was uncertain of the exact time. She assumed, as most people would, that she was looking at a father and son. That single statement, vague, uncorroborated, offered almost apologetically by a woman who wasn't sure it meant anything, became one of the most examined pieces of testimony in the entire case. Investigators canvassed the festival attendee list, cross-referenced vehicle registrations from the parking area, and asked dozens of families whether they recalled a man matching even a loose description, walking with a child who was not, as far as anyone could tell, distressed or resisting. No one else came forward with a matching memory. Photographs taken by festival attendees, hundreds of them, collected in the weeks following the disappearance from disposable cameras, early digital cameras, and a handful of camcorders, were reviewed frame by frame. In an era before smartphones made near-constant documentation the norm, photographic evidence from an event like this was limited and inconsistent, capturing only fragments of the day rather than a continuous record. One photograph, taken by a family from a neighboring town, showed a portion of the parking lot in the background of a birthday portrait, time-stamped at 3:52 p.m. Enhanced and studied for years afterward, it revealed the corner of a vehicle, dark in color, partially obscured by a support pole. that could never be definitively matched to any vehicle registered by attendees that day. It became, in the years that followed, one of the case's most debated and least conclusive pieces of evidence. Perhaps significant, perhaps nothing at all. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters as we go further into this case. If you had been one of those festival goers, glancing at a man and a child from 30 feet away, assuming nothing more than an ordinary afternoon, would you have looked twice? Most of us wouldn't have. That's not a failure of attention. It's simply how strangers move through a crowd unremarked, because nothing about the moment asks us to remember it. By the end of the first week, more than 200 interviews had been conducted. Hotel and motel registries within a 100-mile radius were requested and reviewed. Gas station surveillance footage, where it existed, much of it grainy, black and white and stored on tape rather than digital drives, was pulled and examined for any vehicle that matched the partial description from the parking lot photograph. Toll records, sparse as they were on the rural highways surrounding the festival, were checked for any anomalies in traffic patterns that afternoon and evening. Nothing produced a solid lead. No demand for money ever arrived. No credible sighting was reported in the weeks that followed, despite a media campaign that reached television stations across 3 states and placed the boy's photograph on milk cartons, highway billboards, and the evening news for months. The FBI's National Center for Missing and Exploited Children distributed age-progressed images in the years that followed, imagining what the boy might look like as he grew, first at 8, then at 12, then at 16, images that circulated widely but generated no confirmed sightings. By the time the first snow fell on the valley that year, barely 2 months after the disappearance, the investigation had shifted from an active search to what detectives quietly began referring to, in their own reports, as a sustained inquiry, a case that remained technically open, actively assigned, and periodically revisited, but no longer driven by the urgency of the first 72 hours. The family did not accept that shift easily, and in many ways, they never accepted it at all. There is a particular kind of grief that does not resolve into stages the way we're told grief is supposed to. It doesn't move from denial to acceptance in any orderly way, because there is no confirmed loss to accept, only an absence that stretches forward indefinitely, refusing to become a memory, because it has never been allowed to become a past. That is the grief the boy's parents carried through the years that followed, and it is worth understanding before we move further into this case, because it explains everything that came after. In the first year, the family kept his room exactly as it had been. His mother later described, in an interview given nearly a decade later to a regional newspaper, how she would sit on the edge of his bed some evenings, not to grieve exactly, but simply to remain near the last version of him she had any certainty about. The 4-year-old in the red jacket, not the child he might have become. The couple became, almost without choosing to, advocates for missing children's causes across the state. They attended awareness walks. They spoke at conferences for search and rescue volunteers. They worked, in a quiet and determined way, to keep their son's case from becoming one of the thousands that fade from public memory once the initial media attention passes. Local reporters would return to the story each September, around the anniversary of the festival, publishing brief updates that rarely contained new information, but served in their own way to keep his name in circulation. Every year, investigators would review the file. Tips came in sporadically. A woman in Nevada who believed she'd seen a boy matching an age-progressed photo at a grocery store. A trucker who thought he recognized the composite sketch of the unidentified man at a truck stop in Wyoming. Each tip was logged, and most were cleared within days or weeks, the leads dissolving into coincidence or mistaken identity. None of them, across 18 years, produced anything resembling a genuine breakthrough. By the case's 10th anniversary, the file had grown to include boxes of physical documents, digitized photographs, and a database of more than 400 interviews. The lead detective originally assigned to the case had retired. A younger investigator inherited the file, along with dozens of other unsolved matters on her desk, reviewing it periodically but constrained, as most departments are, by the reality that active cases with fresher evidence demanded more immediate attention. The parents divorced in the case's 12th year, not by their own accounts out of any single conflict, but under the slow erosion that comes from carrying an unresolved loss for over a decade. They remained, notably, on cooperative terms with each other regarding the case itself, both continuing to speak publicly about their son on the rare occasions journalists asked, both keeping their contact information current with the sheriff's department, in case, after all this time, something ever surfaced. What none of them knew, what no one in that valley or in that department or anywhere connected to the case could have known, was that roughly 400 miles away, across a state line, a young boy was growing into adolescence in a household that had constructed, quietly and carefully, an entirely different account of where he had come from. According to what investigators would later reconstruct, the boy had been raised believing he'd been born at home, that a portion of his birth paperwork had been lost during a household move in his infancy, and that certain records had only been formalized years later due to what he was told were administrative delays, common in rural communities during that period. It was not on its surface an implausible story. Home births went undocumented more often than official statistics like to admit, particularly in remote counties with limited access to hospitals, and delayed paperwork was a real, if uncommon, bureaucratic reality. The boy had no memories predating roughly age 5, which is itself entirely unremarkable. Most people cannot recall much from earlier than that age. It is one of the quieter tragedies of this case that the ordinary limits of early childhood memory functioned for nearly 2 decades as an unintentional form of protection around whatever truth had been buried beneath the story he'd been told. He grew up attending local schools under the only name he had ever known. He played on youth sports teams, attended church with the family he believed to be his own, and by all appearances lived an unremarkable, even happy childhood in a small town built around a highway junction and a handful of family-run businesses. Neighbors interviewed years later would describe him, without hesitation, as a normal kid, quiet, a little shy, close to the woman he called his mother. If there was anything unusual in those years, it was not something anyone thought to question at the time. A former neighbor, speaking to investigators long after the fact, would recall, almost as an afterthought, the way people recall details that never seemed significant until asked directly, that the family had always kept to themselves during the boy's earliest years, that visitors were rare, and that by the time most of the neighborhood really got to know the family, the boy was already old enough to be in school. None of it, on its own, meant anything. Families keep to themselves for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with concealment. But taken together years later, these fragments would form the outline of a pattern, one that no single person had ever been positioned to see in full, because no single person held all the pieces at once. That would not change until an entirely unrelated event, on an entirely unremarkable night, put 2 strangers, a state trooper and a nervous young man in the passenger seat of a car with a broken taillight, into the same brief conversation on a dark Montana highway. Trooper Daniel Wren had worked the night shift on that stretch of Montana highway for nearly 6 years by October of 2022. He would later describe the stop in his own written statement as one of hundreds that blurred together across a career built on routine, the kind of night where a broken taillight is the most interesting thing that happens for a 10-hour shift. The car was an older sedan, registered to a woman in her 50s whose name matched the address on file. Behind the wheel sat the registered owner. In the passenger seat sat a young man, early 20s, who was introduced simply as her son. Wren ran both licenses through the system. Both came back clean. No warrants, no flags, no discrepancies of any kind that would have given an ordinary officer any reason to look twice. But Wren, by his own account, had developed over the years a habit that many veteran officers describe half-jokingly as an occupational tic. He made small talk during routine stops, not out of suspicion, but simply because it was easier to fill the minutes it took to process paperwork with conversation than silence. He asked the young man where he was headed, what he did for work, whether he'd grown up in the area. The young man answered easily enough about his job and his plans for the evening, but when the conversation drifted, almost accidentally, toward where he'd been born, something in his manner changed. He said he wasn't entirely sure, that he'd been born at home, that his mother could explain the details better than he could. When Ren, still making idle conversation, asked a follow-up as simple as which town it had happened in, the young man hesitated in a way that Ren later described as longer than it should have taken for someone answering a question about their own life. It is worth pausing on that hesitation because on its own, it means almost nothing. Plenty of people are vague about the circumstances of their own birth, a fact tucked away in family stories, rarely examined, rarely needing to be examined. Most of us could not, if pressed on the side of a highway by a stranger with a flashlight, produce a crisp, confident account of the exact details surrounding our own arrival into the world. Why would we need to? It's not information we're ever asked to defend, but something about the specific texture of the young man's answers struck Ren as different from ordinary vagueness. The responses felt, in his words, rehearsed, not evasive exactly, not defensive, but delivered with the careful cadence of someone repeating a story rather than recalling a memory. When Ren asked a second, unrelated follow-up question, something as simple as which hospital his sister had been born in, mentioned only because the young man had referenced having a half-sister, the young man answered that detail instantly and naturally, without hesitation. The contrast lodged in Ren's mind. One question, about someone else's birth, answered fluidly. Another question about his own answered haltingly, with a script-like quality that didn't match the ease of everything else in the conversation. I think it's worth asking yourself, honestly, would you have noticed that difference? Most of us in Ren's position would have finished the citation, wished the driver a good night, and moved on to the next call without a second thought. That Ren didn't, that he took the unusual step of writing a brief supplemental note in his report, flagging the exchange as something that did not indicate any crime but felt worth documenting, is, in many ways, the hinge on which this entire case eventually turned. Ren issued a warning for the taillight. There was no legal basis to detain either person further, no evidence of any wrongdoing. Nothing beyond a trooper's uneasy instinct that something about a young man's account of his own childhood didn't sit quite right. He let them go. The sedan pulled back onto the highway and disappeared into the dark, and for a few weeks, that might have been the end of it entirely. One more strange, forgettable footnote in a stack of routine traffic reports. But Montana, like most states, had in recent years implemented software systems designed to flag irregularities across large volumes of administrative and law enforcement records. Patterns that a single officer or clerk would never notice on their own, surfaced instead by algorithms built to catch exactly the kind of inconsistency that hides in plain sight across thousands of disconnected documents. Ren's supplemental note, routine as it seemed, entered that system along with everything else generated that night. 3 weeks later, during an unrelated audit cross-referencing state identification records with federal databases, an analyst in a records office some 300 miles away noticed something that on its own might never have registered as significant. The young man's identification documents had been issued and reissued across an unusual sequence of jurisdictions and time periods, with a formal birth certificate not filed until several years after the date it claimed to record. Delayed filings were not, in themselves, unheard of. Rural home births went undocumented far more often than most people realized, but the analyst, working through a routine backlog, flagged the file anyway, not because she suspected anything sinister, but because the pattern didn't match the typical shape of an ordinary delayed filing. It matched more closely something she had only seen a handful of times before in her career, an identity that had been built piece by piece, well after the fact. She forwarded the file to a colleague in a different department entirely, and that department was not one that investigated missing children. It investigated fraud. For weeks, that remained the entire framing of the case as far as the state was concerned. A young man whose paperwork didn't add up, a possible instance of identity irregularity to be resolved through records requests and interviews. No one assigned to the file that Autumn had reason to connect it to an 18-year-old missing persons case, filed a state away, under a different name entirely. That connection would take time and a great deal of ordinary, unglamorous administrative work to surface. The kind of work that rarely makes headlines, but is very often where cases like this one are actually solved. Fraud investigations rarely move with the urgency of a missing persons case. There is no ticking clock, no search grid, No sense that hours matter the way they do in the first days after a child disappears. Instead, these cases unfold through subpoenaed records, quiet phone calls to county clerks, and the slow accumulation of small inconsistencies that, individually, mean almost nothing. The investigator assigned to the file, a state records analyst named Carol Iverson, with over a decade of experience in documentary fraud, began by requesting the young man's complete paper trail: birth certificate, school enrollment records, immunization history, social security documentation, and any hospital or midwife records associated with his reported home birth. What she found was not, on its own, damning. Home births in rural counties were common enough that a missing hospital record raised no immediate alarm. But the birth certificate itself had been filed nearly 4 years after the date it claimed to document, through a delayed registration process that required a notarized affidavit, in this case signed by the boy's mother and a family friend attesting to the circumstances of the birth. The affidavit was legally sufficient. It was also, Iverson noted in her case log, unusually vague, offering little more than the bare minimum required by the form. School enrollment records showed the boy entering kindergarten at age 6 rather than 5, not unusual on its own, since many rural districts allowed flexibility for late enrollment, particularly for children without prior daycare or preschool documentation. Immunization records existed, but began abruptly at what appeared to be around age 5, with no record of the standard vaccinations typically administered in infancy. Individually, each gap had an innocent explanation. Collectively, they described a child who essentially didn't exist on paper before the age of 5. Iverson began contacting people who had known the family during those early years. A retired schoolteacher who had taught in the district for over 30 years recalled the boy joining her class partway through the school year, an unusual but not unheard of occurrence for families that moved frequently for work. She remembered him as quiet, a little behind his classmates in some areas but otherwise unremarkable. A former neighbor, a woman who had lived 2 houses down from the family for nearly 15 years, provided what would become one of the most significant statements in Iverson's entire file. She recalled, when asked directly about the family's early years in the neighborhood, that they had kept largely to themselves during that period. Rare visitors, few social gatherings, a household that seemed almost deliberately private. And then, almost as an aside, she added a detail she said she had never thought twice about until being asked, that she couldn't actually recall the boy being there as an infant or toddler at all. Her clearest memories of him began, she said, once he was already a little kid running around the yard, sometime, by her estimate, around age 4 or 5. He just sort of appeared, she told Iverson, the way any kid does when you're not paying close attention to the exact day they show up. You just notice one day that the neighbor's got a kid now, and you don't think to ask when that started. It was an offhand, almost apologetic observation, the kind of thing people say when they're aware, even as they're saying it, that it probably means nothing. But paired with the fragmented documentation, it was enough for Iverson to widen the scope of her inquiry considerably. She requested family photographs, hoping to establish a visual record of the boy's early years. The family, when asked, provided several boxes of prints and albums, but as Iverson reviewed them methodically, she noticed the same gap reflected in images as in paperwork. Photographs of birthdays, holidays, and everyday family moments existed in abundance from the boy's estimated age of 5 onward. Almost nothing existed from before. There were no hospital newborn photos, no first birthday cake smashed across a high-chair tray, no early toddler snapshots of the kind most families accumulate almost obsessively in a child's first years, particularly in an era when disposable cameras made documentation cheap and constant. When Iverson raised the absence directly with the boy's mother during a follow-up interview, the woman explained that most of their early photographs had been lost in a house fire, an explanation that, when checked against county fire department records, could not be corroborated. No fire had been reported at the family's listed address during the relevant years. That inconsistency, small, quiet, entirely bureaucratic in nature, was the detail that finally pushed the case past the threshold of ordinary paperwork irregularity. Iverson forwarded her complete file, along with a formal recommendation, to a senior prosecutor within the State Attorney General's office, flagging the case not merely as a potential instance of identity fraud, but as one that warranted cross-referencing against unresolved missing persons cases from the surrounding region and the years the boy's earliest records seemed to begin. It was a routine recommendation, procedurally speaking, the kind made dozens of times a year across departments handling document irregularities. But this particular cross-reference search would return a result that no one in that office had been expecting. A name, a date, and a description that lined up with uncomfortable precision to a case filed 18 years earlier, 400 miles away, involving a 4-year-old boy in a red jacket who had last been seen walking toward a parking lot at a harvest festival in northern Idaho. It's worth sitting with how strange that must have felt for Iverson, flipping through a routine fraud file one afternoon and suddenly finding herself staring at the outline of a missing child's case, gone cold nearly 2 decades earlier. She later described it as the single strangest moment of her career, the realization that the paperwork she'd been quietly untangling for weeks might not describe a fraud at all, but something far older and far more painful than anyone in her office had been prepared to find. The moment a cold case and an active fraud investigation collide is rarely as dramatic as it sounds in retrospect. There was no single triumphant phone call, no dramatic reveal in a conference room. Instead, there was a careful, methodical process of verification, undertaken by people who understood that a wrong conclusion here would not simply be an embarrassment. It would be a devastating false hope for a family that had already endured 18 years of uncertainty. The Idaho detective who had inherited the original missing persons file, a woman named Renata Ellis, who had taken over the case nearly 6 years earlier from her retired predecessor, received the referral from the Montana Attorney General's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She would later describe reading the initial summary twice, then a third time before allowing herself to believe it might be real. 18 years of tips that led nowhere had taught her, and everyone who'd touched this file, a certain professional caution about hope. Rather than approach the family immediately, investigators from both states agreed on a methodical path forward: genetic genealogy. Advances in forensic genetic genealogy over the preceding decade had transformed the resolution of cold cases across the country, allowing investigators to establish biological relationships without relying solely on decades-old, potentially incomplete documentation. A discrete DNA sample was obtained from the young man in Montana through cooperative voluntary means, framed initially only as part of the ongoing records verification, not, at that stage, disclosed as a potential connection to a missing child. Simultaneously, investigators reached out to the Idaho parents, now in their late 50s, informing them only that a possible new lead had emerged in their son's case, and that a DNA sample would be helpful to have on file for comparison, a request they had, in truth, fulfilled voluntarily years earlier, their sample sitting in a national missing persons DNA database since the case's 5th year, waiting unmatched for exactly this kind of moment. The comparison took 11 days to process through the appropriate forensic laboratory. 11 days that, for the 2 detectives now quietly coordinating across state lines, felt considerably longer. While the genetic analysis was underway, investigators returned to the festival grounds in northern Idaho. Now, 18 years later, a much smaller annual event held on the same fields, though the crowds had thinned considerably since an economic downturn had reduced regional attendance to festivals of that kind. They re-interviewed festival-goers who could be located, cross-referencing decades-old witness statements against updated information, hoping that time and modern investigative tools might surface something the original canvas had missed. Most of the original witnesses could add little beyond what they'd already told investigators in 2004. Memories, 18 years on, had softened and blurred in the way memories inevitably do. But one witness, the woman who had sold quilts near the parking lot entrance and had given the original uncertain statement about a man and a boy walking together, was located living in a different county. Now in her 70s, she remembered the day clearly, if not the specific faces, and told investigators something she hadn't mentioned in her original statement, either because she hadn't thought it relevant or because it had simply resurfaced with the retelling, that the man she recalled had been wearing a jacket with what she believed was a small embroidered patch, possibly from a trucking company or a hunting outfitter, though she could no longer be certain which. It was a small, uncertain detail, offered nearly 2 decades late, and it would likely never be enough on its own to identify anyone. But it was logged, cross-referenced against the limited employer and business records available from that period, and added to a file that was, for the first time in 18 years, actively growing rather than simply being maintained. What do you make of a detail like that? Vague, unreliable, arriving decades after the fact. I find myself genuinely uncertain whether it matters at all, or whether it's simply the kind of fragment that feels significant only because we're looking for significance in a case that has offered so little of it for so long. Investigators, to their credit, treated it with appropriate caution, worth recording, not worth building a theory around. On the 12th day, the forensic laboratory returned its results to both state agencies simultaneously. More information would follow. The genetic markers were consistent with a parent-child relationship between the Idaho mother and the young man in Montana, at a statistical confidence level investigators described, in careful measured language, as effectively conclusive. Detective Ellis would later say that the moment she read that result, sitting alone at her desk on a grey November afternoon, was the first time in her 6 years on the case that she allowed herself to cry at her desk. The district attorney's office authorized the formal reopening of the case within 24 hours. But confirming who the young man was represented only the beginning of an entirely new phase of the investigation, one that would need to answer questions the original case had never been able to touch. Who had taken him from that fairground 18 years earlier? How he had come to be raised, apparently without incident, under a different identity for nearly 2 decades, and who, if anyone still living, had known the truth all along. Both agencies agreed on one point above all else: the young man himself would need to be approached with extraordinary care. Whatever the truth turned out to be, he had spent his entire remembered life believing a particular story about who he was and where he came from. Whoever delivered the news that this story was, in some fundamental way, untrue, would be reshaping the foundation of his identity in a single conversation, and everyone involved understood that there was no way to do that gently, only carefully. The conversation took place in December of 2022, in a quiet conference room at a state facility in Montana, attended by 2 investigators, a victim's advocate, and the young man himself, who had been told only that new information had emerged regarding his identity documentation and that investigators needed to speak with him directly. According to those present, he listened for several minutes without speaking, asking only a handful of clarifying questions: how certain they were, what the DNA results actually meant, whether there had been some kind of mistake. He did not, by all accounts, react with disbelief, so much as a kind of quiet, absorbing stillness, the sort of reaction that comes when a person is trying to hold 2 entirely incompatible truths in their mind at once: the family he had always known and a family he had never known existed, both now claiming with equal legitimacy to be his own. He agreed, after several days, to meet his biological parents. That meeting, which took place in a private setting arranged by both families' advocates, rather than in front of any cameras, has never been described publicly in detail, and out of respect for everyone involved, this reconstruction will not speculate about what was said in that room. What can be said is that it was, by the account of everyone present, an enormously difficult and enormously emotional encounter, one that offered, for the first time in 18 years, a resolution to the question that had defined the family's entire adult life, while opening an entirely new and far more complicated chapter in the life of a young man who had never asked to have his identity rewritten. The woman who had raised him, the person he had called his mother for as long as he could remember, was interviewed extensively in the months that followed, as investigators worked to determine exactly how the boy had come into her care in 2004, and whether she had known at the time that he had been taken from another family entirely. Her account, delivered through legal counsel, described a version of events in which she had not been present at the fairground, had not participated in any abduction, and had believed, at the time the boy came into her household, a story provided to her by a third party, a story she declined on the advice of her attorney, to fully detail publicly while the investigation remained active. Whether that account is complete, whether it is entirely accurate, or whether it represents only a partial version of a much longer and more complicated chain of events, remains as of this reconstruction an open question, one that continues to be examined by investigators in both states as the case moves through its next phase. What can be said with confidence is this: the boy who disappeared from a harvest festival in northern Idaho in September of 2004 did not die that day. He grew up 400 miles from where his biological parents continued to search for him under a name that was not his own, believing a story about his own origins that was not true, in a household that has yet to fully account for how he came to be there. The largest questions this case raises: who physically removed him from that fairground, whether the woman who raised him was involved in that initial act or merely inherited him afterward through some intermediary, and who else across 18 years may have known the truth and said nothing, remain unresolved as of this telling. Investigators have not ruled out additional arrests. The case remains active. I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's not the ending most of us want from a story like this. We want the full account, the name of whoever stood at that fairground and made the decision that reshaped two families forever, the reasoning, however inadequate, that might explain it. This case, at least for now, doesn't offer that. It offers something narrower: confirmation that he is alive, that he has been found, and that the 18-year absence his parents carried has finally, after everything, come to an end. The rest, the who, and the why, may yet be answered. Or it may remain, like so much of this case has for nearly 2 decades, frustratingly, permanently incomplete. What would you have done if you were in Trooper Wren's position that night? Turning back after issuing a warning, sitting with a small nagging feeling that something about a stranger's answer to an ordinary question didn't quite add up. I suspect most of us would have let it go. I'm genuinely not sure I wouldn't have too, and yet that small, easily dismissed instinct is the entire reason this family finally has an answer, after 18 years of having none at all. The boy's parents, now in their late 50s, have asked for privacy as their family navigates what comes next. In a brief statement released through their attorney, they thanked the trooper, the analyst, and the 2 detectives who carried this case across state lines and across 18 years, saying only that they were grateful beyond words to know, finally, that their son was alive, and that they understood, better than most people ever could, that some questions take far longer to answer than anyone should ever have to wait. This has been a fictional reconstruction inspired by the patterns of real missing persons investigations. The long silences, the small procedural details that occasionally crack a case open decades later, and the families who carry an absence for years without ever being allowed to call it a loss. The names, individuals, and specific events in this story are not real. They were created to reflect on how cases like this genuinely unfold, and to honor, in a general sense, the families who live through circumstances like these. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Archive 26. If this case stayed with you, we'd genuinely like to know what you think happened in that household during those 18 years. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate this kind of careful, investigative storytelling, we'd be grateful if you'd like this video and consider subscribing for more reconstructions like this one. We'll see you in the next case.